When Ranger Clara Dawson was found hanging upside down from a pine tree in Wyoming's most dangerous wilderness, left to die by corrupt officials. No one expected salvation to come from a scarred black Mustang stallion. What happened next defied every law of nature and human understanding. This is the true story of betrayal, survival, and an impossible bond that changed everything. Stay with me until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this incredible story has traveled across the world. The morning mist clung to the Bridger Teton National Forest like a shroud, and Clara Dawson should have known it was an omen. 28 years old, with steel-gray eyes that had seen too much during her army tours in Afghanistan, Clara had developed an instinct for danger that had kept her alive through 3 deployments and 2 years as a federal ranger. But as she guided her government-issued Ford Ranger down the winding dirt road toward Sector 7, that instinct was screaming warnings she chose to ignore. The radio crackled to life, static mixing with the voice of her supervisor, Randall Cole. His tone carried the usual bureaucratic weight that made Clara's jaw tighten every time she heard it. "Ranger Dawson, confirm your position." Cole's voice filtered through the speaker professional, but somehow cold in a way that had always bothered her. Clara keyed the radio, her eyes scanning the dense pine forest that pressed against both sides of the narrow road. "About 15 minutes out from the coordinates you provided, sir. Still don't understand why this couldn't wait for backup." There was a pause too long, Clara realized later, before Cole responded. "Time-sensitive situation, Dawson. We've got reports of poaching activity in the area, and with your military background, you're the best qualified to handle reconnaissance alone. Standard procedure." Nothing about this felt standard. In her 2 years with the Forest Service, Clara had never been sent alone into such remote territory, especially not into Sector 7, an area known for its dangerous terrain and the occasional presence of drug runners moving product through the wilderness corridors. The sector encompassed nearly 40 square miles of some of the most rugged country in Wyoming, with steep ravines, dense forest, and enough places for trouble to hide that even experienced rangers traveled in pairs. "Copy that," Clara replied, though doubt gnawed at her gut. "ETA 10 minutes. She clicked off the radio and pressed the accelerator, eager to get this mysterious assignment over with. The Ford bounced and lurched over the rutted road, and Clara found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with Cole just 3 days earlier. She'd been in his office, a cramped space that smelled of coffee grounds and old paper, when she'd presented her findings about irregularities in the hunting permit system. For months, Clara had been tracking what appeared to be systematic violations: permits issued for areas that should have been protected, hunting quotas that exceeded sustainable limits, and a pattern of activity that suggested someone was selling access to protected wildlife. "This goes deep, sir," she'd told Cole, spreading photographs and documentation across his desk. "Someone's been issuing permits under false documentation, and the money trail leads to—" "That's enough, Dawson." Cole's interruption had been sharp, almost angry. "I'll handle this from here. You focus on your regular patrol duties." The dismissal had stung, but Clara had pressed on. "Sir, with respect, this affects the entire ecosystem in our jurisdiction. If we don't—" "I said I'll handle it." Cole's voice had carried a finality that brooked no argument. "That's an order, Ranger." Now, as Clara navigated the increasingly treacherous road toward whatever awaited her in Sector 7, she wondered if her investigation had somehow triggered this assignment. The timing felt too convenient, too coincidental. The coordinates Cole had provided led to a clearing she'd never seen before, despite having studied every topographical map of the region. As she parked the Ford and stepped out, the silence was absolute. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, nothing but the whisper of wind through pine needles. Clara's hand instinctively moved to her service weapon, a Glock 19 holstered at her hip. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to lean inward like spectators in an arena. At the center stood a makeshift camp, a single tent, a cold fire ring, and scattered equipment that looked abandoned. But it was the tire tracks that made Clara's blood run cold. Fresh tracks, multiple vehicles leading in and out of the clearing in a pattern that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Clara keyed her radio. "Control, this is Ranger Dawson. I'm at the coordinates, but this doesn't look like a simple poaching operation. Request immediate backup." Static answered her. She tried again, adjusting the frequency. Nothing. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was in a dead zone beyond the reach of the radio repeaters that covered most of the forest. Cole would have known that, should have known that. A branch snapped behind her. Clara spun her hand, moving to her weapon, but she was too slow. The first man emerged from the tree line like a shadow if in a substance, tall, lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in places where the law was negotiable. He was already pointing a rifle at her chest. "Easy there, Ranger girl," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent Clara couldn't immediately place. "Let's keep this nice and simple." Two more men materialized from different points around the clearing, their movements coordinated and professional. Not poachers, Clara realized with growing dread. These were operators, military or ex-military, the kind of men who knew how to move through hostile territory and eliminate threats. "Hands where we can see them," the first man ordered. "Slow and easy." Clara raised her hands, her mind racing through tactical options. 3 armed men, professional bearing, positioned to create a crossfire that would cut her down if she tried to run. Her service weapon might as well have been on the moon for all the good it would do her. "You're making a mistake," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I'm a federal officer. Killing me will bring more heat than whatever you're trying to protect is worth." The man smiled, and it was the coldest expression Clara had ever seen. "Who said anything about killing you, sweetheart? Our orders are very specific." Orders. The word hit Clara like a sledgehammer. These men weren't random criminals, they were following instructions. Someone had sent them here, someone who knew she'd be alone, someone who knew exactly when and where to find her. "Cole," she whispered, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "Smart girl," the second man said, moving closer while keeping his rifle trained on her. "Too smart for her own good, according to our employer." The betrayal cut deeper than fear. Randall Cole, her supervisor, the man who'd hired her, who'd praised her dedication and attention to detail, had sold her out. The investigation into the permit irregularities hadn't been dismissed. It had been buried, and she was being buried with it. "Here's how this is going to work." The first man continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining a simple business transaction. "You're going to have an accident. Tragic, really. Young Ranger alone in dangerous territory, equipment failure, exposure to the elements. These things happen in the wilderness." Clara's military training kicked in, suppressing panic and focusing her mind on survival. She had to buy time, had to find an angle, any advantage that might keep her alive long enough to escape. "You don't understand," she said, putting a tremor in her voice that wasn't entirely feigned. "I've already filed reports. Other people know about the permits, about the corruption. Killing me won't stop anything." The lie came easily, born of desperation and the slim hope that these men might hesitate if they thought her death would create more problems than it solved. The third man, who'd remained silent until now, stepped forward. He was older than the others, with gray stubble and eyes like chips of flint. "Nice try, but we know exactly what you filed and what you haven't. Your supervisor's been very thorough in his briefings." The casual mention of Cole's cooperation made Clara's stomach turn. How long had this been planned? How many layers of corruption had she stumbled into? "Move, to," the first man ordered, gesturing toward the forest with his rifle. "We've got a nice spot picked out for your accident." They marched her deeper into the woods, following what appeared to be an animal trail that wound between massive pine trunks and over fallen logs slick with moss. Clara memorized every landmark, every turn, building a mental map even as she searched desperately for an opportunity to escape. After 20 minutes of hiking, they reached their destination, a small clearing dominated by an ancient pine tree with branches thick enough to support significant weight. At the base of the tree lay a coil of rope and a set of climbing gear that made Clara's blood freeze. "Here's the story," the gray-stubbled man explained with the patience of someone who'd done this before. "Federal Ranger investigating reports of illegal activity, equipment failure during a solo reconnaissance mission. Found 3 days later, tragic victim of exposure and predation. Closed casket funeral, departmental review finds no negligence, life goes on." The rope was military grade, the kind used for rappelling and tactical operations. These men had planned every detail, anticipated every question that might arise during the inevitable investigation. "You won't get away with this," Clara said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "We already have," the first man replied. "Your boss made sure of that." They forced her to the base of the tree, and Clara saw the branch they'd selected approximately 15 feet off the ground, thick enough to support her weight, positioned so that her body would be visible to any search team, but not accessible without climbing equipment. The realization of what they intended hit her like a physical blow. They weren't going to kill her outright. They were going to hang her upside down and leave her to die slowly, her death designed to look like an accident involving failed rappelling equipment. "Please," she whispered, the word torn from her throat by genuine terror. "Please don't do this." But mercy wasn't part of their plan. They bound her hands with military efficiency, then secured the climbing harness around her legs with the professional competence of men who'd done similar work in darker corners of the world. As they hauled her up into the tree, Clara's world inverted. Blood rushed to her head and the forest floor swayed 15 feet below her like a green and brown ocean. The rope bit into her ankles, and she could already feel the circulation being cut off to her feet. "How long?" she gasped, fighting against the disorientation of hanging upside down. "Depends on a lot of factors," the gray stubbled man called up to her with clinical detachment. "Your fitness level, outside temperature, whether the local wildlife finds you before dehydration sets in. Could be hours, could be days." They left her there as the sun climbed higher into the sky, their footsteps fading into the vast silence of the wilderness. Clara twisted slowly in her rope prison, the world spinning around her in a nauseating carousel of green and brown and blue. Hours passed. The blood pooling in her head created a constant throbbing pressure that made thinking difficult. Her attempts to work free of the ropes only tightened the knots, and the harness cut deeper into her legs with every movement. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward the western horizon. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, her body's system struggling to cope with the unnatural position and the stress of her situation. Dehydration set in quickly, her mouth becoming cotton dry as her sweat evaporated in the mountain air. By late afternoon, she could no longer feel her feet. The rope had cut off circulation so completely that her legs might as well have belonged to someone else. Her vision blurred and she found herself slipping into dangerous periods of unconsciousness that lasted longer each time. It was during one of these episodes that she first heard it, the sound of something large moving through the forest below. Clara forced her eyes open, blinking away the haze of dehydration and oxygen deprivation, and saw them. Wolves. 3 of them, lean and gray, moving through the clearing with the predatory grace of apex predators. They'd caught her scent, drawn by the smell of fear and blood where the rope had chafed her skin raw. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible even to herself. "Not like this." The wolves circled the tree, their yellow eyes fixed on her swaying form. They seemed to understand that she was helpless, that gravity and time were doing their work for them. All they had to do was wait. Clara closed her eyes and tried to summon the strength for one last effort to free herself. But her body had nothing left to give. 2 years of investigating corruption, uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the Forest Service. And this was how it ended, as prey for scavengers in a forgotten corner of the wilderness. The sound that cut through her despair was unlike anything she'd ever heard. It started as a low rumble like distant thunder, but grew into something that made the very air vibrate. The wolves froze their heads, snapping toward the sound, ears pricked and bodies tense. What emerged from the tree line was impossible. A horse. But not just any horse. This was a Mustang stallion of extraordinary size, standing at least 18 hands high with a coat so black it seemed to absorb light. Scars crisscrossed its hide, speaking of battles fought and survived in the wild places where civilization had no power. Its mane flowed like liquid night, and its eyes. Clara had never seen eyes like that on any animal. They held intelligence, awareness, and something that looked almost like purpose. The stallion stood at the edge of the clearing, those impossible eyes fixed on her swaying form, and for a moment time seemed suspended. The wolves scattered. These apex predators, masters of the mountain wilderness, fled before the stallion like rabbits before a storm. In seconds, they were gone, leaving only the Mustang and Clara in the fading light of afternoon. The stallion approached the tree with careful, deliberate steps. It circled once, twice, studying the situation with an intelligence that defied explanation. Then it reared up on its hind legs, front hooves pawing at the air as it studied the branch from which Clara hung. What happened next would haunt Clara's dreams for the rest of her life. The Mustang positioned itself directly beneath her, then backed up several steps. With a movement that combined raw power with impossible precision, it launched itself forward and upward. Its teeth closed on the rope just above the harness, and Clara felt the entire tree shake with the force of the stallion's leap. Again and again, the Mustang repeated the maneuver, each time gaining height, each time getting closer to the critical point where the rope was secured to the branch. Clara could only hang there in amazement as this wild creature, this force of nature, worked with methodical determination to free her. On the seventh attempt, the rope gave way. Clara crashed to the forest floor in a tangle of rope and harness, her body screaming as blood flow returned to her extremities. She lay there gasping, staring up at the canopy of pine needles that filtered the afternoon sun into dancing patterns of light and shadow. The Mustang stood over her, its massive head lowered, breath warm against her face. For a moment, human and horse regarded each other in silence, two beings who had no business sharing this moment but who were bound together by circumstances that defied explanation. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her voice cracked and barely audible. The stallion snorted softly as if acknowledging her gratitude, then lowered itself to the ground beside her. The meaning was clear. Climb on. Clara's rational mind rebelled against the idea. Wild Mustangs didn't allow humans to ride them. They certainly didn't rescue federal rangers from execution trees and offer to carry them to safety. This was impossible, a hallucination brought on by dehydration and trauma. But the stallion's eyes held steady, patient waiting. With movements that sent lightning bolts of pain through her circulation-starved limbs, Clara pulled herself onto the Mustang's back. The stallion rose smoothly, and suddenly Clara was 15 hands off the ground, mounted on a creature that represented everything wild and untamed about the American West. "I don't know where to go," she admitted, leaning forward to speak into the stallion's ear. "I don't even know if I can trust anyone." The Mustang began to move, not toward the clearing where Clara had left her vehicle, but deeper into the wilderness, following trails that existed only in the ancient memory of wild creatures. As they traveled, Clara felt strength slowly returning to her body, circulation resuming its normal flow, her mind clearing from the fog of trauma and dehydration. The sun was setting by the time they reached the ridgeline, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reflected off the snow-capped peaks in the distance. From this vantage point, Clara could see for miles in every direction, an endless expanse of wilderness that stretched to the horizon. The Mustang paused at the crest of the ridge, and Clara understood why. Below them, perhaps 3 miles distant, she could see the lights of the ranger station, her sanctuary, and her destination. But between their current position and safety lay terrain that would challenge even an experienced horseman on a trained mount. "Are you sure about this?" Clara asked, though she knew the stallion couldn't understand her words. In response, the Mustang began the descent, picking its way down the rocky slope with a sure-footedness that spoke of years spent navigating the treacherous mountain terrain. Clara could only hold on and trust in the creature that had already saved her life once. The journey down the mountain was like something from a dream. The Mustang moved through the darkness with supernatural confidence, following paths that Clara couldn't even see, avoiding obstacles that should have been impossible to detect in the failing light. Streams were forded with splashing leaps that sent spray flying in silver arcs. Fallen logs became mere stepping stones for the powerful stallion. As they traveled, Clara found herself thinking about the betrayal that had brought her to this moment. Cole's involvement in the permit scheme had clearly run deeper than she'd imagined. The men who'd tried to kill her were professionals, expensive ones, which meant significant money was at stake. But what kind of operation could justify murdering a federal officer? The answer when it came to her was chilling in its simplicity. The permits weren't just about hunting, they were about access. Someone was using the Forest Service's authority to grant access to protected wilderness areas for purposes that had nothing to do with wildlife management. Drug trafficking, perhaps, or illegal mining operations. The permits provided cover legal documentation that would explain the presence of vehicles and personnel in areas where they should never have been allowed. And Clara had stumbled onto it following a paper trail that threatened to expose the entire operation. The Mustang's hooves struck stone, and Clara looked up to realize they'd reached level ground. The ranger station was less than half a mile away, its windows glowing with warm yellow light that promised safety and answers. But as they approached, Clara felt a new kind of dread settling in her stomach. If Cole was involved in the conspiracy, how many others were compromised? How deep did the corruption run? Walking into that station might be walking into another trap, one baited with the promise of rescue. The stallion seemed to sense her hesitation. It slowed to a walk, then stopped entirely about 100 yards from the station. In the distance, Clara could see figures moving behind the lighted windows, her fellow rangers going about their evening duties, unaware that one of their own had nearly been murdered. "I have to go in," she told the Mustang. "I have to find out who I can trust." The great horse turned its head to look at her, and in those dark eyes Clara saw something that might have been understanding. Then, with a movement so gentle it barely disturbed her precarious balance, the stallion lowered itself to the ground. Clara slid from its back, her legs still shaky from her ordeal, but functional enough to carry her. She turned to thank her rescuer one more time, but the Mustang was already gone, melted back into the darkness from which it had emerged. For a moment, Clara wondered if the entire experience had been a hallucination. But the rope burns on her ankles were real, and she was standing outside the ranger station when she should have been dead in the woods. Taking a deep breath, Clara walked toward the station, toward the light and warmth and the people who might or might not be allies in the fight that was clearly far from over. As she reached for the door handle, Clara made herself a promise. Whatever came next, whatever depths of corruption she uncovered, she would see this through to the end. She owed that much to herself, to the public trust she'd sworn to protect, and to the magnificent creature that had given her a second chance at life. The door opened and Clara Dawson stepped back into a world where nothing was as it seemed, where the badge on her chest might make her a target rather than a protector, and where the only ally she could truly trust was a wild Mustang that had appeared from the wilderness like an answer to a prayer she'd never thought to make. The fluorescent lights of the ranger station felt harsh against Clara's eyes after hours in the wilderness twilight. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her hand still gripping the metal handle as conversations died and faces turned toward her. The familiar scents of coffee gun oil and old wood should have been comforting, but instead they felt foreign, almost threatening. "Jesus Christ, Clara." The voice belonged to Jake Morrison, a ranger she'd worked with for 18 months. He was on his feet instantly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "Where the hell have you been? Cole's been going crazy trying to reach you on the radio." Clara's stomach clenched at the mention of Cole's name, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. Around the station's main room, 5 other rangers were staring at her with expressions ranging from relief to concern. Any one of them could be part of Cole's network. Any one of them could be reporting back to the men who'd tried to kill her. "Equipment malfunction," she said carefully, stepping fully into the room and letting the door close behind her. "Radio went dead about 6 hours ago." "You look like hell," said Sarah Chen, the station's communications specialist. Her dark eyes were sharp with concern as she took in Clara's disheveled appearance, the rope burns visible on her wrists the way she favored her left leg where circulation was still returning to normal. "What happened out there?" Clara's mind raced. She needed information before she could decide who to trust, needed to understand the scope of the conspiracy before she revealed her hand. But she also needed medical attention and a secure way to contact federal authorities outside of Cole's influence. "Got turned around in Sector 7, she said, sticking as close to the truth as possible. "Terrain's rougher than the maps indicate. Had to improvise my way back." She paused, studying the faces around her. "Where's Cole?" "Emergency meeting at regional headquarters," Jake replied. "Left about 2 hours ago. Said he'd be back first thing in the morning." There was something in his tone, a slight hesitation that made Clara's pulse quicken. "What kind of emergency?" Jake exchanged glances with Sarah, and Clara caught the silent communication that passed between them. They knew something they weren't sure they should share. "There's been developments," Sarah said finally, "about your investigation into the permit irregularities." Clara's blood ran cold. "What kind of developments?" "Maybe you should sit down," Jake suggested, gesturing toward one of the plastic chairs arranged around the room's central table. "You've been through enough for one day." "I'm fine," Clara said sharply. "Tell me what's happened." Sarah pulled a manila folder from her desk and set it on the table. "This came in through official channels about 3 hours ago. Internal Affairs wants to interview you regarding allegations of misconduct in your handling of the permit investigation." The folder contained a single sheet of official letterhead, but the words might as well have been written in fire. Allegations of evidence tampering, unauthorized access to restricted files, insubordination and conduct unbecoming a federal officer. At the bottom, Randall Cole's signature authorized the investigation. "This is bullshit," Clara breathed, but even as she said it, she understood the elegant trap that had been laid for her. If she'd died in the woods as planned, this document would have provided convenient explanation for why she'd been sent alone into dangerous territory. Disciplinary action gone wrong, tragic accident during suspension proceedings. "Clara." Jake's voice was gentle but firm. "Is there something you need to tell us? Because this doesn't look good, and if there's more to this story." She looked around the room again, studying each face with new intensity. Jake Morrison, 15-year veteran, with a spotless record and 2 commendations for bravery. Sarah Chen, former Air Force communications specialist who joined the service after her military discharge. Tom Bradley, young Ranger fresh out of training who still believed the system worked the way it was supposed to. Maria Santos, veteran of the Border Patrol, who'd transferred north to escape the violence of the Mexican cartels. David Kim, quiet and methodical, who knew the regulations better than anyone. Lisa Turner, wilderness survival expert, who could track a ghost through solid rock. Any one of them could be reporting to Cole. But looking at their faces, seeing genuine concern mixed with confusion, Clara made a decision that could either save her life or end it. "I need to show you something," she said, moving to the station's computer terminal. "But first, I need to know that this conversation stays in this room until I can figure out who else might be involved." "Involved in what?" Tom asked, his young face creased with worry. Clara's fingers moved across the keyboard, accessing the files she'd compiled over months of investigation. "In the biggest case of corruption this forest has ever seen." The documents appeared on screen, one by one: permit applications with forged signatures, financial records showing payments to shell companies, GPS coordinates that led to areas where no legitimate hunting should have occurred. Clara had been building this case methodically, carefully, following paper trails that led deeper into the wilderness and higher up the chain of command. "These permits," she said, pointing to a cluster of applications all signed by the same fictitious hunting guide, "granted access to areas that are supposed to be completely protected. No hunting, no camping, no motorized vehicles. But look at the satellite imagery from these dates." She pulled up another window, showing aerial photographs taken on the days the permits were supposedly being used. Instead of hunters, the images showed vehicles, temporary structures, and patterns of activity that suggested something far more sophisticated than illegal hunting. "Drug runners," Maria said immediately, her Border Patrol experience evident in her recognition of the patterns. "This is a trafficking corridor. Someone's been using hunting permits to legitimize movement through protected areas." "It gets worse." Clara continued pulling up financial records. "The permit fees are being paid through accounts traced to known cartel front companies. We're not just talking about corruption, we're talking about federal officers providing material support to narcotics trafficking." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. David Kim was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. "How high does this go?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "But Cole's signature is on some of these approvals, and tonight—" She paused, weighing how much to reveal. "Tonight, someone tried to kill me." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Sarah's face went pale, and Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon. "What do you mean, tried to kill you?" Jake's voice was deadly serious now. Clara made her choice. "Cole sent me alone to Sector 7 on what he claimed was a routine investigation. When I got there, 3 armed men were waiting for me. Professional operators, not local criminals. They knew exactly when and where I'd be." She pulled up her sleeve, showing the rope burns on her wrists. "They strung me up in a tree and left me to die, made it look like an equipment accident." "How did you get away?" Tom's voice was barely above a whisper. Clara hesitated. The truth sounded impossible even to her, and she'd lived through it. "I had help. Someone cut me down and got me back here." "Someone," Sarah pressed. "Who?" "That's not important right now. What matters is that Cole is compromised, probably others too. We need to contact federal authorities outside the Forest Service chain of command." "Wait," David said, holding up a hand. "Before we go any further, we need to think about this carefully. If what you're saying is true, if there really is a conspiracy this deep, then we're all in danger just by being in this room." "He's right," Maria added. Cartels don't leave loose ends. If they tried to kill you once, they'll try again. And if they think we know what you know." The lights in the station suddenly went out. Emergency lighting flickered on a moment later, casting everything in an eerie red glow that turned familiar surroundings into something from a nightmare. Clara's hand moved to her weapon, and she saw others doing the same. "Generator malfunction," Tom suggested hopefully. Sarah was already at her communications console trying to raise the local power company. "No response on any frequency," she reported, her voice tight with tension. "This isn't a scheduled outage." Through the station's windows, Clara could see that the surrounding area was completely dark. No lights from the nearby town, no illumination from the highway that ran past the station. Whatever had cut their power had affected a much larger area. "This is coordinated," Maria said, moving to one of the windows and peering out into the darkness. "Professional operation." Jake was at another window, and his sharp intake of breath made everyone turn. Vehicles, 3 of them coming up the access road with no lights. Clara felt ice form in her stomach. They'd found her tractor back to the station, and now they were coming to finish what they'd started. But this time, innocent people would die alongside her. "We need to get out of here," she said, moving toward the station's rear exit. "Now." "Wait," David's voice stopped her. "If we run, we look guilty. Maybe this is legitimate law enforcement responding to the internal affairs complaint." "Legitimate law enforcement doesn't cut power grids and approach without lights," Maria snapped. "This is a hit team." The sound of vehicles stopping outside was clearly audible now, followed by the soft thud of car doors closing. Clara counted at least 6 distinct sounds, more men than had tried to kill her in the woods. "Sarah, can you get a message out on any frequency?" Clara asked urgently. "Emergency radio's on battery backup, but I don't know who to trust with a message." "FBI field office in Jackson. Tell them federal officers under attack at Bridger Station requesting immediate assistance." Sarah's fingers flew over her equipment, but before she could transmit, the station's front door exploded inward. Not opened, exploded as if hit by a battering ram or explosive charge. Armed figures poured through the opening, their faces covered by tactical masks, their weapons trained on the Rangers huddled in the emergency lighting. "Nobody move." The voice was electronically distorted, but Clara recognized the tone, the same cold professionalism she'd heard in the woods. "Hands where we can see them." Clara counted 6 attackers, all dressed in black tactical gear, all moving with military precision. This wasn't a simple execution. This was a raid designed to look like a federal operation, complete with authentic-seeming equipment and procedures. "What do you want?" Jake demanded, his hands raised but his voice steady. "Ranger Clara Dawson," the lead attacker replied. "The rest of you weren't supposed to be here." The casual way he said it chilled Clara to the bone. These men had expected to find her alone, probably working late on reports, as she often did. The presence of 6 other Rangers was an unwelcome complication, but not one that would stop them from completing their mission. "I'm here," Clara said, stepping forward. "Let the others go. They don't know anything." "I'm afraid that's no longer true," the leader said, and Clara heard the death sentence in his voice. "Your little presentation was quite thorough, very inconvenient for our employers." They'd been watching. Somehow they'd had surveillance on the station, had heard everything Clara had revealed about the corruption that permits the trafficking operation. Now, everyone in the room was a liability that needed to be eliminated. "You made one mistake," Clara said, playing for time while her mind raced for options. "You assumed I came back here alone." It was a bluff, but the leader's head tilted slightly and she could sense uncertainty behind the mask. "Explain." "My backup," Clara said, putting every ounce of conviction she could muster into her voice. "Federal agents positioned around this station. You're surrounded." "You're lying." "Am I? Check your vehicles." The leader gestured to one of his men who spoke quietly into a radio. A moment later, static answered him. Then another attempt with the same result. Clara felt a surge of hope. Something was happening outside, something that was disrupting their communications and making the leader nervous. She pressed her advantage. Federal agents have been tracking this corruption for months. "You think I was working alone? You think the FBI doesn't know about cartel operations in protected wilderness areas?" "Sir," one of the attackers called out, his voice tight with concern, "I'm not getting response from the perimeter team." The leader's weapon swung back toward Clara, but before he could speak, the lights went out again. This time, even the emergency lighting failed, plunging the station into complete darkness. In the chaos that followed, Clara heard gunfire shouts, the sound of bodies hitting the floor. She dropped and rolled, using her knowledge of the station's layout to navigate in the darkness toward where she remembered Sarah's desk being positioned. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, then another. The attackers were trying to re-establish control, but something had gone wrong with their carefully planned operation. Clara heard one of them speaking urgently into his radio. "Control, this is Alpha Team. We have complications at target site. Unknown contacts engaging from multiple positions. Request immediate extraction." More gunfire erupted, but this time it was coming from outside the station. Through the shattered front door, Clara could see muzzle flashes in the darkness, the strobing light of a firefight that seemed to involve more people than could possibly be explained. "Federal agents!" a voice shouted from outside. "This facility is under federal protection. Surrender your weapons." But even as relief flooded through Clara at the sound of legitimate law enforcement, she heard something else that made her blood freeze. The voice shouting orders wasn't human. It was the call of a wild stallion rising above the gunfire, like a war cry from another age. The sound seemed to galvanize the attackers. "We're blown," the leader said into his radio, "initiating contingency protocol." One of his men produced what looked like a small electronic device. Clara realized with horror what it was: a detonator. They were going to destroy the station, eliminate all evidence of their presence, and kill everyone inside in the process. "Get down!" she screamed to the other Rangers, but before the device could be activated, the station's rear wall exploded inward, not from an explosion, but from something massive striking it with tremendous force. Through the jagged hole in the wall came the impossible sight that Clara had hoped never to see again. The black Mustang stallion charged into the station like a force of nature, its hooves striking sparks from the concrete floor, its massive frame filling the space with raw, primal power. The attackers turned their weapons toward this new threat, but in the confined space of the station, the stallion was unstoppable. What followed was less a fight than a force of nature unleashing itself upon human prey. The Mustang moved through the crowded room with impossible grace, its hooves finding targets with surgical precision, its teeth and weight becoming weapons that no amount of tactical training could prepare for. Clara heard bones breaking, heard screams of pain and terror, as trained killers found themselves facing something that belonged to an older, wilder world where their technology and tactics meant nothing. In less than 30 seconds, it was over. Emergency lighting flickered back on, revealing a scene that would be burned into Clara's memory forever. 5 of the 6 attackers lay motionless on the floor, their tactical gear scattered, their weapons useless. The 6th, the leader, was backing toward the shattered front door, his weapon trained on the stallion that stood between him and escape. "What the hell are you?" he whispered, and for the first time his electronically distorted voice carried genuine fear. The stallion took a step forward, and the man's nerve broke. He turned and ran into the darkness, leaving behind equipment, weapons, and any pretense of professional composure. Clara stood slowly, her eyes fixed on the magnificent creature that had now saved her life twice in one day. Around the room, her fellow Rangers were picking themselves up, staring in amazement at their unlikely savior. "Clara," Jake's voice was hoarse with shock. "What the hell is going on?" Before she could answer, new voices came from outside, real federal agents. This time their badges and identification clearly visible in the emergency lighting. Clara recognized the lead agent as someone she'd met at a training conference, a woman named Patricia Vance from the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. "Ranger Dawson," Agent Vance called out as she entered through the destroyed front entrance. "Are you injured?" "I'm okay," Clara replied, though she was anything but okay. "Agent Vance, what are you doing here?" "Following up on intelligence about federal corruption related to cartel activities. We've been tracking financial irregularities in permit systems across 3 states. She paused, taking in the destruction around them. "Though we weren't expecting quite this level of escalation." "The corruption goes deeper than permit fraud," Clara said, gesturing toward the scattered equipment left by the attackers. "Someone's been using Forest Service authority to facilitate drug trafficking, and they're willing to kill federal officers to protect it." Agent Vance's expression darkened as she examined the tactical gear scattered around the room. "This is military-grade equipment. These weren't local criminals." "No," Clara agreed. "These were professionals, and my supervisor, Randall Cole, sent me into an ambush earlier today. He's part of this." "Cole's in federal custody as of 3 hours ago," Agent Vance said, and Clara felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly knocked her down. "We arrested him during that emergency meeting he thought he was attending." Around them, federal agents were securing the scene, collecting evidence and providing medical attention to the Rangers who'd been caught in the crossfire. But Clara's attention remained fixed on the stallion, which stood quietly in the center of the destroyed room, as if waiting for something. "Agent Vance," Clara said carefully, "about what happened here. The way we survived this attack, there were circumstances that might be difficult to explain in an official report." Vance followed Clara's gaze to the Mustang, and her eyebrows rose. "I see. And these circumstances played a role in your survival. A significant role." The FBI agent studied the stallion for a long moment, then looked back at Clara. "In my experience, Ranger Dawson, the important thing in a situation like this is that federal officers survived an attack by persons unknown. The specific details of how that survival was accomplished are less important than the fact that justice will be served." It was as close to official sanction as Clara was likely to get. Agent Vance understood that some stories were better left partially untold, that some explanations would only complicate prosecutions and endanger ongoing investigations. "We'll need statements from everyone," Vance continued, "but that can wait until tomorrow. For now, I suggest you all get medical attention and some rest." As the federal agents continued their work, Clara approached the stallion that had now saved her life twice in 12 hours. The great horse lowered its head, allowing her to place her hand against its neck. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't understand what's happening here, but thank you." The stallion's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, Clara felt as if she were looking into something far older and wiser than any animal should possess. Then, with a soft snort that might have been acknowledgement, the Mustang turned and walked through the hole it had made in the station's rear wall. Clara followed, watching as the stallion disappeared into the darkness of the wilderness from which it had emerged. Behind her, the station buzzed with activity as federal agents processed what would become one of the largest corruption cases in Forest Service history. But standing there in the cool mountain air, looking out at the vast expanse of wilderness that stretched to the horizon, Clara knew that her story with the Mustang was far from over. Whatever force had brought them together, whatever purpose was being served by their unlikely partnership, this was only the beginning. As she turned to go back inside and face the questions, reports, and investigations that would dominate the coming weeks, Clara caught sight of something that made her pause. There in the soft earth near the station's foundation were hoof prints, not the scattered marks of a horse in battle, but a deliberate pattern that led away from the station in a straight line toward the mountains. The stallion hadn't just wandered away. It had left a trail clear and unmistakable in the moonlight, pointing toward whatever came next in this impossible partnership between a federal ranger and a creature that belonged more to legend than reality. Clara memorized the direction, then went inside to begin the long process of explaining how corruption, betrayal, and an act of nature had collided in the heart of the Wyoming wilderness. But even as she prepared her statement for federal investigators, her mind was already following that trail into the mountains toward whatever destiny awaited her, and the magnificent stallion that had chosen to protect her. The hoofprints led Clara deeper into the wilderness than she'd ever ventured, following game trails that seemed to exist only in the memory of wild things. 3 days had passed since the attack on the station, 3 days of debriefings with federal agents, medical examinations, and the surreal experience of watching her case against the corruption ring expand into a multi-state investigation. But through it all, Clara's mind kept returning to the trail the stallion had left, calling to her like an unanswered question. Agent Vance had granted her administrative leave pending the completion of the investigation, acknowledging that Clara needed time to process the trauma of betrayal and attempted murder. What Vance didn't know was that Clara had no intention of spending that leave in counseling sessions or safe houses. She had questions that demanded answers, and those answers lay somewhere in the wilderness where logic ended and legend began. The morning sun was just cresting the peaks when Clara reached the end of the hoofprint trail, a hidden valley nestled between two ridges that didn't appear on any topographical map she'd ever seen. The valley was perhaps half a mile wide, surrounded by towering pines and granite cliffs that created a natural amphitheater. At its center lay a meadow so perfectly circular it might have been designed by some cosmic architect. And there, grazing in the morning light as if he'd been waiting for her arrival, stood the black stallion. Clara dismounted from the borrowed horse she'd ridden from the station, a reliable mare named Sage, who'd carried her faithfully through the night, but now seemed nervous in the presence of the wild Mustang. She ground-tied Sage at the valley's edge and walked forward alone. Her boots whisper quiet on the thick grass. The stallion raised his head as she approached those impossible dark eyes, studying her with an intelligence that made her skin prickle. But this time Clara noticed something she'd missed in the chaos of their previous encounters. The stallion wasn't alone. They emerged from the tree line like ghosts materializing from mist. A dozen wild Mustangs, each one magnificent in its own right, but none matching the sheer presence of the black stallion that led them. There were mares with foals, young stallions testing their strength, and older horses bearing the scars of hard-won survival. Together they formed a band that represented everything pure and untamed about the American West. "My God," Clara whispered, understanding flooding through her like a revelation. This wasn't just a wild horse. This was the leader of one of the last truly wild herds in the lower 48 states, a genetic legacy that stretched back to the Spanish conquistadors and the Native American tribes who'd first understood the partnership between human and horse. The black stallion stepped forward, separating himself from his herd, and Clara saw something she hadn't noticed before. Around his neck, nearly hidden by his flowing mane, was a leather cord. Not a halter or bridle, but something far older, a simple thong of worked leather that held a small object against his chest. Clara moved closer, drawn by curiosity and the strange trust that had developed between them. The stallion didn't retreat, didn't show any of the wariness that should have been his natural response to human presence. Instead, he lowered his great head, allowing Clara to see what hung from the leather cord. It was a badge tarnished silver, old enough that the details were worn smooth, but unmistakably the star of a law enforcement officer. Clara's breath caught as she read the inscription, U.S. Marshal James Thunder Horse, 1887. Thunder Horse, she said aloud, and the stallion's ears pricked forward at the sound. That was your name, wasn't it? Or maybe it was his name. The implications hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just any wild Mustang. This was a horse with a history, a connection to law enforcement that stretched back more than a century. But how was that possible? No horse lived that long, and yet the intelligence in those dark eyes suggested experiences that spanned far more than a normal equine lifetime. Clara reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the aged leather of the cord. As her skin made contact with the badge, images flashed through her mind. With startling clarity, a Native American man in a marshal's uniform, riding across vast plains, pursuing outlaws through canyons and over mountains, bringing justice to lawless territories, where federal authority was measured in courage rather than bureaucracy. She jerked her hand back, heart pounding. The visions had felt real, more real than memory, as if she'd somehow accessed the experiences embedded in the metal and leather. "You were his horse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marshal Thunder Horse's mount, but that was over 100 years ago." The stallion stepped back and turned toward the far end of the valley, where Clara now noticed a structure she'd missed in her initial survey. Partially hidden by a stand of aspen trees was a cabin. Its logs weathered gray with age, but still solid, still inhabited by someone who understood the wilderness well enough to live within it, rather than despite it. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, and as Clara watched, a figure emerged from the doorway. She expected to see an old mountain man, some hermit who'd chosen solitude over civilization. Instead, she found herself looking at a Native American woman who appeared to be in her 70s, her silver hair braided with beads and feathers, her clothing a mixture of traditional and modern that suggested someone comfortable bridging different worlds. "You've finally come," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly across the meadow despite the distance. "Thunder has been waiting for you for 3 days." Clara felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Waiting for me? How did you know I was coming?" The woman walked toward them with the steady gait of someone who'd spent a lifetime in rough country. As she drew closer, Clara could see laugh lines around dark eyes that held the same impossible intelligence she'd seen in the stallion's gaze. "I'm Mary Thunder Horse," the woman said, stopping a few feet away. "James was my great-great-grandfather, and Thunder here has been telling me about a ranger who needed help." Clara stared at her, then at the stallion, then back at the woman. Telling you horses don't what? Don't communicate, don't remember, don't carry the spirits of their ancestors. Mary's smile was gentle but knowing. You're thinking like a white person, Clara Dawson. In my world, in Thunder's world, impossible is just another word for magic you don't understand yet. The casual use of her name should have alarmed Clara, but instead she felt a strange sense of rightness, as if she'd found something she didn't know she'd been searching for. How do you know my name? Thunder showed me, Mary said simply. Just like he showed me the corruption you uncovered, the men who tried to kill you, the battle at the ranger station. He's been watching you for months, Clara, watching and waiting. Clara's rational mind rebelled against what she was hearing, but the evidence of her own experiences made denial impossible. The stallion had appeared at the exact moment she needed rescue, had known precisely where to find her, had acted with purpose rather than instinct. Watching me, why? Mary gestured toward the cabin. Come, there are things you need to understand, and they're too important for meadow conversation. The cabin's interior was larger than it appeared from outside, with rooms that seemed to extend further back than the building's external dimensions should have allowed. The main room was dominated by a stone fireplace where coffee simmered in a blackened pot, and the walls were covered with photographs, maps, and documents that spoke of a lifetime spent documenting something the outside world would never believe. Mary poured coffee into 2 metal cups and gestured for Clara to sit at a rough wooden table. What do you know about the history of law enforcement in this territory? Some, Clara replied carefully. Federal marshals, territorial sheriffs, the usual frontier justice. The usual version, Mary agreed. But there was another version, one that doesn't appear in history books. My great-great-grandfather was part of it. She pulled a photograph from the wall, a formal portrait of a man in marshal's clothing, but with features that were unmistakably Native American. Beside him stood a magnificent black horse that could have been Thunder's twin. James Thunderhorse was appointed as a U.S. Marshal in 1885, Mary continued, the first Native American to hold that position in this territory. He had a gift passed down through generations of my family, the ability to communicate with horses in ways that went beyond normal training or handling. Clara studied the photograph, noting the resemblance between the historical horse and the stallion that had saved her life. That's Thunder's ancestor, in a way. But the connection is more complicated than genetics. Mary moved to another wall where a map showed the Bridger-Teton region marked with dozens of colored pins. For over a century, horses from Thunder's line have served as guardians of this wilderness. They've protected travelers, fought off predators, and yes, helped law enforcement officers who found themselves facing corruption and betrayal. You're talking about a supernatural horse, Clara said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew how ridiculous her skepticism sounded given what she'd experienced. I'm talking about a spirit that chooses to manifest in the physical world when justice demands it, Mary corrected. Thunder isn't just a horse, Clara. He's the embodiment of something older than our laws, older than our borders. He's the wild justice that existed before courts and judges and bureaucrats. Clara sipped her coffee, using the familiar ritual to ground herself in reality while her worldview rearranged itself around impossible truths. And he chose to help me because corruption in the Forest Service threatens everything he's sworn to protect. The land, the wildlife, the balance between civilization and wilderness. Mary pulled out a thick folder filled with documents and photographs, but also because you have something he recognizes. The folder contained evidence of other cases spanning decades, missing hikers found by mysterious horses, corrupt officials exposed through convenient accidents that led to discovery of evidence, drug runners who reported being chased out of protected areas by what they described as devil horses that appeared from nowhere. James Thunderhorse died in 1923. Mary said, pointing to a newspaper clipping, shot while pursuing a gang of cattle rustlers who were using federal land as a hideout. He was buried with full honors, and his horse disappeared into the wilderness the day after the funeral. But Thunder was here to help me last week. Thunder, the spirit, the force, whatever you want to call it, has been here ever since. Sometimes as one horse, sometimes as many, always watching, always protecting. Mary met Clara's eyes directly, and now he's chosen you. The words hung in the air like smoke from the fire, heavy with implications Clara wasn't sure she was ready to accept. Chosen me for what? Before Mary could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed from the valley entrance. Clara moved to the window and saw 3 black SUVs winding their way down the narrow trail that led to the meadow. Federal vehicles moving with the purposeful coordination of an official operation. Agent Vance. Clara recognized the lead vehicle. How did they find us? Mary was already moving toward the back of the cabin, her movements quick and efficient despite her age. GPS tracker in your borrowed horse, she said matter-of-factly. Thunder warned me this might happen. Warned you how? The same way he's been communicating since this started. Pay attention, Clara. You're about to learn something important about the choice you're facing. Outside, Clara could hear car doors slamming and voices shouting orders. Agent Vance's voice rose above the others, professional but tense. Ranger Dawson, we know you're here. We need to talk. Clara moved toward the front door, but Mary caught her arm. Before you go out there, understand what's happening. The corruption you uncovered was bigger than permits and hunting licenses. It was a test. A test of what? Of whether our government institutions could be trusted to protect the wilderness or whether older forms of justice would be needed. Mary's grip tightened. Thunder has been watching how this case develops, how the system responds to corruption from within. Your choice now will determine what happens next. Ranger Dawson. Agent Vance's voice was closer now, probably near the cabin's front door. We have information about additional threats to your safety. We need to bring you in for your protection. Clara looked through the window and saw federal agents positioning themselves around the cabin, their body language suggesting this was more than a friendly protective detail. They were prepared for resistance, prepared to take her by force if necessary. They're scared, Mary said, following Clara's gaze. Your investigation exposed more than they wanted exposed. There are people in Washington who would rather bury this whole thing than let it grow into a larger scandal. Are you saying Agent Vance is corrupt? I'm saying Agent Vance answers to people who answer to people who might be corrupt. And right now, the easiest solution to their problem is to discredit the ranger who started asking difficult questions. The front door burst open without warning, and Agent Vance entered with her weapon drawn but pointed toward the floor. Behind her came 4 other agents, all wearing tactical gear that suggested they'd expected trouble. Ranger Dawson, Vance said, her voice carefully controlled. Step away from the window and place your hands where I can see them. Clara complied, but slowly, her mind racing through the implications of what was happening. Agent Vance, what's this about? I thought I was on administrative leave. New developments. We've received intelligence that suggests you may have been feeding information to environmental extremist groups. Vance's expression was professional but apologetic. I'm sorry, Clara, but you're under arrest pending investigation into potential charges of treason and domestic terrorism. The words hit Clara like physical blows. Treason. Domestic terrorism. Someone had manufactured charges serious enough to justify armed arrest, serious enough to discredit anything she might say about corruption in the Forest Service. That's ridiculous, Clara said, but even as she spoke, she understood the elegant trap that had been laid. Her investigation had exposed too much, threatened too many people, reached too high up the chain of command. The easiest solution was to paint her as a radical, a traitor who'd betrayed her oath for environmental extremism. I understand your confusion, Vance said, and Clara heard genuine regret in her voice. But the evidence is compelling. Financial transfers to known eco-terrorist organizations, communications with individuals on federal watch lists, suspicious activity in protected wilderness areas. All of it fabricated, Clara knew, but fabricated well enough to stand up to initial scrutiny. By the time the truth emerged, if it ever did, her credibility would be destroyed and the corruption case would be buried beneath allegations of federal officer misconduct. Agent Vance, Mary spoke for the first time since the agents had entered. You might want to reconsider what you're doing here. Vance turned toward the elderly Native American woman with the kind of dismissive attention federal agents reserve for irrelevant civilians. Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. Please step aside. Actually, it concerns me very much, Mary replied calmly. You're about to arrest the one person who's been fighting to protect this wilderness from the very corruption your agency has failed to address. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to... The rest of Vance's words were lost in the sound that erupted from outside the cabin, the thunder of hoofbeats, not just one horse, but many moving at full gallop toward the meadow, where the federal vehicles were parked. Through the windows, Clara saw them coming. Thunder led the charge, his black coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning sun. But behind him came the entire herd, a dozen wild Mustangs running with the fury of creatures protecting their territory from invasion. "What the hell?" one of the agents muttered, moving to a window. The Mustangs reached the federal vehicles and began systematically destroying them. Hooves kicked in windshields, teeth tore at tires, and the full weight of wild horses turned expensive government equipment into twisted metal and broken glass. Outside, "Now!" Vance shouted to her team, "Protect the vehicles!" But as the agents rushed from the cabin, Clara saw the futility of their mission. The horses weren't mindless in their destruction. They were tactical coordinated, working together to disable the vehicles while avoiding the agents who tried to drive them off. Thunder himself stood between the agents and their primary vehicle, his massive frame blocking any attempt to reach the radio equipment they'd need to call for backup or evacuation. "How is this possible?" Vance demanded, turning back to Clara. "Horses don't behave like this." "These aren't ordinary horses," Mary said quietly. "These are Guardians, Agent Vance, and they don't appreciate federal officers who come into their territory to arrest someone fighting corruption." Clara felt the truth of what was happening settle into her bones like cold mountain air. This was the choice Mary had mentioned. Trust the system that had already betrayed her once, or align herself with something older, wilder, more fundamentally committed to justice. "Clara," Mary's voice was urgent now, "you have to decide. Go with them and disappear into a federal facility where your voice will be silenced, or trust Thunder to show you another way." Outside, the destruction continued. The federal agents were firing warning shots into the air, trying to drive off the Mustangs, but the horses seemed completely unafraid of gunfire. If anything, the sound of weapons only made them more aggressive in their systematic dismantling of the federal response. Thunder appeared at the cabin's open door, his dark eyes fixed on Clara with unmistakable intent. The meaning was clear. "Come with me now or lose this chance forever." Agent Vance saw the exchange and raised her weapon, not quite pointing it at Clara, but making the threat obvious. "Ranger Dawson, you're coming with us." "That's not negotiable." Clara looked at the federal agent who'd seemed like an ally just days before then, at Mary Thunderhorse, who represented something she didn't fully understand, then at the magnificent stallion who'd already saved her life twice. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Clara moved toward Thunder, and Vance's weapon swung to track her movement. "Stop right there, Clara. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if necessary." "No," Clara said, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised her. "You won't." She continued walking toward Thunder, and the stallion stepped into the cabin, his hooves striking the wooden floor with sounds like gunshots. Vance and her remaining agents backed away instinctively, their weapons trained on a target they couldn't possibly justify shooting. Clara reached Thunder's side and placed her hand on his neck, feeling the power that radiated from his massive frame. "Agent Vance, when you report back to Washington, tell them this: the corruption in the Forest Service goes deeper than anyone wants to admit, and the people responsible aren't going to stop what they're doing just because one investigation got buried." "Clara, don't do this," Vance pleaded. "Whatever you think you're accomplishing, this will only make things worse." Clara swung herself onto Thunder's back, feeling the familiar sensation of connecting with something wild and untamed. Maybe it's time to try a different approach to justice. Thunder turned and walked from the cabin with the dignity of a creature that had never known defeat. Behind them, Mary Thunderhorse smiled at the federal agents with the satisfaction of someone who'd lived long enough to see her faith vindicated. "You might want to call for extraction," Mary told Agent Vance conversationally. "It's about a 15-mile hike back to the main road, and those boots don't look like they're made for wilderness travel." As Thunder carried Clara from the cabin toward the tree line where his herd waited, she heard Agent Vance shouting into her radio, trying to explain to federal supervisors how a routine arrest had turned into a complete mission failure at the hooves of wild horses. But Clara's attention was already focused forward toward whatever destiny awaited her, in partnership with a creature that embodied justice, older than courts, older than badges, older than the corruption that had driven her from the world of official law enforcement into something far more primal and infinitely more dangerous. Thunder carried Clara deeper into wilderness that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of any map, following paths that wound through canyons carved by ancient waters and over ridges that scraped the belly of storm clouds. For 3 days, they traveled the Mustang herd, moving like a river of muscle and mane through country so remote that Clara began to understand why the federal government had never successfully cataloged all the protected lands under their jurisdiction. On the third evening, as they crested a ridge that overlooked a valley Clara had never seen in any geological survey, Thunder stopped and pawed the ground 3 times. The signal was unmistakable. They had arrived at their destination. The valley below was a natural fortress surrounded by sheer cliffs that would be impossible to navigate without mountaineering equipment. The only entrance appeared to be a narrow canyon that twisted through the rock like a snake barely wide enough for a horse and rider. At the valley's heart lay structures that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. It wasn't just one building, but an entire complex carved into the living rock of the canyon walls. Ancient petroglyphs covered every visible surface, telling stories and symbols that predated written history. But scattered among the primitive dwellings were modern additions, solar panels, satellite dishes, and equipment that suggested this hidden sanctuary was very much connected to the contemporary world. "What is this place?" Clara whispered, though she suspected Thunder couldn't answer in any way she'd understand. The Mustang began the treacherous descent into the valley, picking his way down a trail that seemed to exist more in memory than reality. As they reached the valley floor, figures emerged from the carved dwellings, men and women of various ages, all sharing the weathered look of people who'd chosen wilderness over civilization. But it was the horses that truly took Clara's breath away. Dozens of them grazed in the valley's meadows, and each one bore the same unmistakable bearing as Thunder. These weren't just wild Mustangs, these were descendants of something legendary, a bloodline that carried intelligence and purpose in their very bones. An elderly man approached as Thunder came to a stop near what appeared to be the complex's central building. He moved with the confident stride of someone completely at home in this impossible place, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of natural leadership. "Clara Dawson," he said, and it wasn't a question. "We've been expecting you." Clara dismounted slowly, her legs stiff from 3 days of riding her mind, struggling to process yet another impossible encounter. "Who are you people?" "The last guardians," the man replied. "My name is Robert Standing Bear, and this is Echo Valley, the place where law enforcement comes when the law itself becomes corrupt." He gestured toward the carved dwellings, and Clara realized that what she'd taken for ancient ruins were actually inhabited structures, home to a community that had found a way to live completely outside the reach of federal authority. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "This particular community about 40 years, but people have been coming to this valley for over a century, ever since James Thunderhorse first discovered it, during his pursuit of a gang of federal marshals who'd been taking bribes from cattle barons." Clara felt the familiar sensation of reality shifting beneath her feet. Federal marshals taking bribes that wasn't in any history I've read. "Because the government wrote that history," Standing Bear replied, "just like they'll write the history of your corruption case assuming they get the chance." He led her toward the central building, which proved to be carved directly into the cliff face, its interior cool and spacious despite being hewn from solid rock. The walls were covered with documents, photographs, and maps that told a story Clara was only beginning to understand. "Every person in this valley came here for the same reason you did," Standing Bear explained, gesturing toward the assembled evidence. "They discovered corruption within federal agencies, tried to report it through official channels, and found themselves marked for elimination by the very system they'd sworn to serve." Clara studied the faces in the photographs, men and women in uniform badges representing agencies from the Forest Service to the FBI to the Bureau of Land Management. All of them looked like people who'd believed in justice until the system they served proved unworthy of that belief. "You're talking about a shadow community of rogue federal agents." "We prefer uncompromised law enforcement," a new voice said from behind her. Clara turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching her, bearing unmistakably military despite her civilian clothes. "I'm Janet Martinez, former DEA. I've been here for 8 years, ever since I discovered my supervisor was taking cartel money to look the other way on drug shipments through protected wilderness areas." 8 years. Clara stared at her. "The government thinks you're dead." As far as official records are concerned, I died in a climbing accident in Glacier National Park. Much easier than explaining why a decorated DEA agent would suddenly disappear after filing reports about corruption that reached the deputy director level. Standing Bear pulled out a thick folder marked with Clara's name. We've been tracking your case since you first started investigating the permit irregularities. Thunder brought us reports of everything, your discovery of the financial connections, Cole's betrayal, the attempt on your life, even the attack on the ranger station. Clara opened the folder and found comprehensive documentation of her entire investigation, but expanded with information she'd never seen. Financial records that traced the corruption through multiple government agencies, photographs that showed the scope of the operation, and evidence that proved the hunting permit scheme was just one small piece of a much larger conspiracy. This goes all the way to Washington, she breathed, reading through documents that implicated officials she'd never suspected. Interior Department, Justice Department, even members of Congress. 30 years of systematic corruption, Martinez said grimly. Using federal land management as cover for drug trafficking, illegal mining, arms dealing, and human trafficking. The permits you discovered weren't anomalies. They were standard operating procedure for an operation that generates over $2 billion in annual revenue. The scale of what Clara was seeing made her earlier investigation seem almost naive in its limited scope. She'd thought she was uncovering local corruption, maybe something that reached the regional level. Instead, she'd stumbled onto a criminal enterprise that had been operating at the highest levels of government for decades. Why haven't you exposed this? She asked. With evidence like this, surely. Exposed it to whom? Standing Bear's voice carried bitter experience. The FBI. Half their senior management is implicated. The Justice Department. They're the ones who've been providing legal cover for the operation. Congress, 3 senators and 12 representatives are documented as receiving payments through the network you uncovered. Clara sank into a chair carved from the valley's stone, the weight of revelation crushing down on her. Then what's the point? If the corruption reaches that high, if there's no institution that can be trusted? There's always been another way, Standing Bear said quietly. Indigenous justice, frontier justice, the kind that existed before courts and bureaucrats and political appointees complicated the simple concept of right and wrong. You're talking about vigilantism. I'm talking about survival, Martinez interjected. The people in this valley represent the last uncorrupted federal law enforcement officers in the country. We've spent years documenting crimes, building cases, and preparing for the day when the official system collapses under the weight of its own corruption. And that day is coming sooner than you might think, Standing Bear added, pulling out another folder. The corruption you exposed has accelerated their timeline. They're planning something called Operation Clearcut, a systematic elimination of every federal officer, activist, or civilian who poses a threat to their network. Clara opened the new folder and felt ice form in her stomach. Lists of names, locations, planned accidents, and disappearances that would remove hundreds of potential threats over the course of 6 months. Her own name was near the top of the first list, marked for immediate action. They're planning to kill all of these people. They've been killing people for years, Martinez said. Rangers who asked too many questions, environmental activists who discovered illegal activities, even congressional staffers who stumbled onto financial irregularities. Your case was supposed to be just another tragic accident in a long series of convenient deaths. Standing Bear moved to a wall-mounted map of the western United States marked with pins of different colors. Red pins mark confirmed kills, federal officers and civilians who died under suspicious circumstances while investigating activities connected to the corruption network. We've documented over 300 deaths in the past decade. Clara studied the map and felt sick. The red pins formed a pattern that covered every major national forest and park in the region, a constellation of murder that had been disguised as accidents, natural disasters, and criminal activity by unrelated parties. How is this possible? How could something this large operate without anyone noticing? Because it's generational, Standing Bear explained. This network has been building power and eliminating threats for 30 years. They've had time to place their people in key positions, to compromise oversight agencies, to create financial structures that are virtually impossible to trace. And because they've been very careful about who they eliminate and how, Martinez added, Look at the pattern: isolated individuals investigating specific cases, people who could be made to disappear without triggering major investigations, deaths that could be explained in ways that didn't point towards systematic assassination. A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Clara heard voices, the sound of horses, and an urgency that suggested something important was happening. Standing Bear moved to a window carved into the rock and peered out toward the valley entrance. "Riders coming in fast," he reported. "3 of them, and they're pushing their horses hard." Clara joined him at the window and saw 3 figures on horseback racing down the narrow trail that led into the valley. Even at distance, their body language communicated desperate urgency. "Trouble," Martinez said grimly. "Nobody rides like that unless they're bringing bad news." The riders reached the valley floor and dismounted near the central building, their horses lathered with sweat from hard travel. Clara recognized the lead rider as Sarah Chen, the communication specialist from her ranger station, but Sarah looked haggard and frightened in a way that spoke of recent trauma. "Sarah," Clara called out as she emerged from the building. "What are you doing here? How did you find this place?" Sarah's relief at seeing Clara was obvious and overwhelming. "Clara, thank God you're alive. They told us you'd been killed in a climbing accident, that your body had been recovered from a ravine in Sector 12. The casual lie sent a chill through Clara's blood. The corruption network was already implementing their cover story, declaring her dead to explain her disappearance and discredit any evidence she might have uncovered. "Who told you that?" "Emergency bulletin from regional headquarters," Sarah replied, pulling out an official document. "Came through 6 hours ago, along with orders for all personnel to cease any investigation related to your permit fraud case." Clara read the bulletin and felt the systematic efficiency of the conspiracy at work. Her death was being used to shut down the entire investigation, to scatter the evidence she'd gathered, and to intimidate anyone who might have been inclined to continue her work. "Sarah, how did you get here? This place isn't on any map." Sarah gestured toward the 2 riders who'd accompanied her, Jake Morrison and Tom Bradley, both looking as shaken as she did. Jake remembered stories his grandfather used to tell about hidden valleys where federal officers went when the government became too corrupt to serve. Tom's been tracking unusual horse activity in the wilderness for months, following reports of coordinated Mustang behavior that didn't make sense. Jake stepped forward, his expression grim. "Clara, we need to talk. About Cole, about what happened after you disappeared, about what's happening at the station." They moved inside the carved building, where Standing Bear provided coffee and a secure place to talk. As Jake began his report, Clara felt the scope of the conspiracy expanding once again. "Cole didn't just disappear after his arrest," Jake said. "He was released after 6 hours in federal custody, with all charges dropped and an official apology from the Justice Department. Turns out the evidence against him was deemed insufficient for prosecution." "That's impossible," Clara protested. "I had documented proof of his involvement." "Evidence that mysteriously disappeared from federal databases," Sarah added. "Every file you created, every document you uploaded, every photograph you took, all of it vanished from the system like it never existed." Tom pulled out a tablet and showed Clara what remained of her investigation in the official record. Her months of meticulous documentation had been reduced to a single paragraph noting minor irregularities in permit processing that had been satisfactorily resolved through administrative review. "They didn't just bury your case," Tom said. "They erased it completely, made it so there's no evidence it ever existed in the first place." Standing Bear and Martinez exchanged glances that communicated volumes about the sophistication of the enemy they were facing. "This is their standard protocol," Standing Bear said. "When an investigation gets too close to the truth, they don't just shut it down, they rewrite history to make it appear the investigation never happened." "But we were there," Jake protested. "We saw the evidence, we fought off the attack on the station. They can't just pretend none of that happened." "Can't they?" Martinez pulled out another folder. "Check your personnel files, Ranger Morrison. See what the official record says about that night." Jake accessed his file through Tom's tablet and went pale as he read. According to federal records, there had been no attack on the ranger station. Instead, there had been a training exercise that had gone wrong when blank ammunition had been mistakenly loaded with live rounds. The destruction had been attributed to an accidental explosion in the equipment locker. And all personnel had been commended for their professional response to an unexpected training emergency. "This is insane," Sarah whispered. "They're rewriting reality. They're protecting a criminal enterprise worth billions of dollars," Clara said, understanding finally sinking in. "And they have the resources to make truth disappear whenever it threatens their operation." Standing Bear moved to another section of the cave where computer equipment hummed quietly in the artificial twilight. "Which brings us to why you're really here, Clara. Why Thunder chose you specifically, why he brought you to us at this particular moment." He activated a large screen that displayed a map of the western United States. But this map was different from anything Clara had seen before. Instead of political boundaries or geographical features, it showed movement patterns, flows of money, personnel, and resources that revealed the true scope of the corruption network. "For 30 years we've been gathering evidence and waiting for the right opportunity to expose this conspiracy," Standing Bear continued, "but we've always lacked one crucial element, someone inside the system with the credibility and access to make the revelation stick." "You want me to go back," Clara said, understanding where this was leading. "You want me to return to federal service and expose the conspiracy from within." "Not return," Martinez corrected. "Infiltrate. We've been preparing for years to place someone in a position where they could document ongoing crimes and build an airtight case that couldn't be buried or discredited." Standing Bear pulled up another display, this one showing organizational charts for various federal agencies. "There's a position opening next month, Deputy Assistant Director for Wilderness Protection in the Interior Department, high enough to access sensitive information, important enough to have credibility with media and congressional oversight, but not so visible that they'll immediately suspect infiltration." Clara stared at the organizational chart, seeing the position he was describing and understanding the incredible opportunity it represented. From that position, she could access files from every federal land management agency, could coordinate investigations across multiple jurisdictions, could build the kind of comprehensive case that would be impossible to ignore or suppress. "You're talking about a years-long undercover operation," she said. "Living a lie, pretending to be something I'm not, all while documenting crimes by people who've already tried to kill me once." "Yes," Standing Bear said simply. "And if you're discovered, if your cover is blown, you'll die. They won't make the mistake of leaving you alive a second time." Clara looked around the cavern at the faces of people who'd already made the choice she was being asked to make. Former federal officers who'd given up their lives, their identities, their connections to the outside world in order to fight corruption that had infected every level of government. "There's another option," she said slowly. "We could expose everything we have right now, take it to the media, to international authorities, to anyone who'll listen." "With what credibility?" Martinez asked. "You're officially dead, Clara. The rest of us are officially missing or disgraced. We're conspiracy theorists hiding in a cave making wild accusations against respected government officials. But if someone were in position to provide ongoing documentation," Standing Bear continued, "if someone could prove that crimes were being committed in real time with official access and unimpeachable credentials." Clara understood the logic, but the personal cost was staggering. To take the position they were describing, she'd have to fake her own resurrection, create a new identity, and spend years living among the very people who'd tried to murder her. Outside, Thunder's call echoed through the valley. Not the scream of a wild horse, but something deeper, more complex. It sounded almost like a question. "He's asking what you've decided," Standing Bear said. "Thunder doesn't speak in words, but he communicates with perfect clarity to those who know how to listen." Clara walked to the cave entrance and looked out at the magnificent stallion who'd saved her life 3 times now. In the fading light of evening, surrounded by his herd in this hidden valley, Thunder looked like something from legend given flesh. "If I do this," she said, "if I take this position and try to build a case from the inside, what guarantee do I have that the evidence won't just disappear like everything else?" "None," Standing Bear admitted. "Except for the fact that we'll be providing backup documentation for everything you discover, multiple copies hidden in multiple locations with fail-safes that ensure the truth will surface even if something happens to you." "And Thunder will be watching," Martinez added. "He has ways of moving through the wilderness that make surveillance impossible. If you're in danger, if your cover is compromised, he'll find a way to get you out." Clara studied the stallion's intelligent eyes and saw something that might have been encouragement. This magnificent creature had already risked everything to save her life repeatedly. Could she do less in return? There's something else you need to know, Sarah said quietly. About what's happening at the station, about why we really came looking for you. She pulled out a final document, this one marked with emergency classification seals. Operation Clearcut isn't just a plan, it's already begun. 3 federal officers were killed in accidents yesterday. 5 environmental activists disappeared last week. They're accelerating the timeline because your investigation spooked them. Clara read the document and felt the weight of hundreds of lives pressing down on her shoulders. People were dying because she'd uncovered a conspiracy too large for the system to handle. The only question was whether she had the courage to see it through to whatever end awaited. Thunder called again, and this time Clara understood what he was asking. Not whether she would take the risk, but whether she was ready to become something more than a federal ranger, following regulations and procedures. Whether she was ready to become a guardian. Clara looked one more time around the hidden valley at the community of people who'd chosen principle over safety, at the horses that carried the spirits of lawmen from a simpler time when justice was measured in courage rather than procedures. Then she walked toward Thunder, knowing that whatever came next would either expose the greatest government conspiracy in American history or destroy everyone foolish enough to believe that truth could triumph over power. But as she reached the stallion's side and felt his strength radiating through her bones, Clara discovered that the choice had already been made. It had been made the moment Thunder first appeared in the wilderness to save her life, setting in motion events that would either redeem the promise of American justice or reveal its complete corruption. Either way, there was no path but forward. Clara's transformation began with a death that never happened and a resurrection that took 6 months to orchestrate. In the federal records, Ranger Clara Dawson had perished in a climbing accident in Sector 12. Her body never recovered from the ravine where she'd supposedly fallen. But in the sterile offices of a private clinic in Denver, Dr. Sarah Kim Clara's new identity, complete with fabricated medical degree and 15 years of wilderness medicine experience, was being interviewed for the position that would place her at the heart of the conspiracy. The interview took place in a conference room 30 floors above the Denver streets, where Assistant Secretary Marcus Webb presided over a panel that included representatives from Interior Justice and Homeland Security. Webb was younger than Clara had expected, perhaps 45, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of political ambition rather than genuine commitment to conservation. Dr. Kim Mama Webb said, reviewing the meticulously crafted dossier that Standing Bear's network had spent months creating. Your background in wilderness medicine is impressive, but this position requires someone who understands the delicate balance between conservation and economic development. Clara had rehearsed this moment countless times with Martinez and Standing Bear, learning to inhabit the persona of a doctor who'd grown tired of treating hiking injuries and wanted to make a broader impact on wilderness policy. Mr. Webb, I've spent 15 years watching our protected lands become increasingly stressed by unregulated access and inadequate oversight. I believe my medical background gives me a unique perspective on the health of these ecosystems. She paused, allowing a note of controlled passion to enter her voice. When I see illegal dumping poisoning watersheds or unauthorized development destroying critical habitats, I see symptoms of a disease that requires systematic treatment rather than Band-Aid solutions. Webb exchanged glances with the other panel members, and Clara caught something in their expressions that suggested her answer had hit the right notes. These were people who appreciated talk of systematic solutions, of approaches that could be controlled and managed from the top down. The Deputy Assistant Director position comes with significant responsibilities, said Janet Foster, the Justice Department representative. You'd be coordinating wilderness protection efforts across multiple agencies with access to classified information about ongoing investigations and security matters. I understand the gravity of the position, Clara replied. My years in emergency medicine have taught me the importance of maintaining confidentiality while working under pressure. Lives depend on making the right decisions with incomplete information. What Clara didn't say was that she'd spent the past 6 months learning exactly how extensive those responsibilities would be. From her position, she'd have access to permit databases, financial records, personnel files, and most importantly, the coordination protocols that linked wilderness activities with what appeared to be legitimate security operations. The interview continued for 2 hours, touching on policy details, interagency coordination, and Clara's vision for improving wilderness protection in an era of increasing political pressure. Throughout the process, she felt the weight of Thunder's marshal badge against her chest, hidden beneath her professional clothing like a talisman of older, simpler justice. 3 days later, the call came through. Dr. Sarah Kim had been selected for the position pending final security clearance and background verification. Clara had successfully infiltrated the highest levels of the conspiracy that had tried to kill her. Her first month in the Interior Department building was a masterclass in how corruption could hide in plain sight. From her office on the 15th floor, Clara had access to databases that revealed the true scope of the network she was investigating. The hunting permits that had started her journey were just one small component of an operation that used federal land management as cover for activities that generated billions in untraceable revenue. Dr. Kim, her secretary, announced one morning in late October, "Webb would like to see you in conference room C, something about a special project." Clara gathered her files and made her way to the conference room, where she found Webb waiting with 3 men she didn't recognize. They wore expensive suits and had the kind of watchful bearing that suggested backgrounds in law enforcement or military intelligence. "Sarah," Webb said, using the casual tone that had developed between them over the weeks, "I'd like you to meet some colleagues who work on the more sensitive aspects of wilderness security." The introductions were deliberately vague, first names only job titles that could have meant anything, handshakes that lasted just long enough to convey the impression of men evaluating a potential asset. Clara recognized the dynamic immediately from her military experience. She was being recruited for something beyond her official duties. "Dr. Kim," said the man who'd introduced himself as Richard, "we understand you have extensive experience with remote area operations, medical support for wilderness activities that require discretion." Clara nodded carefully. "I've provided medical consultation for activities where official documentation might compromise operational security. Search and rescue operations, mostly in areas where media attention could interfere with effectiveness." It was the opening they'd been waiting for. Over the next hour, Richard and his colleagues outlined what they described as a wilderness security initiative designed to protect federal lands from environmental terrorism, drug trafficking, and other criminal activities that exploited the remote nature of protected areas. "The challenge," Richard explained, "is that traditional law enforcement approaches don't work in wilderness environments. We need people who understand the terrain, who can operate independently, and who appreciate the need for flexible responses to evolving threats." Clara listened with growing understanding as they described operations that sounded like legitimate security work, but contained details that revealed their true nature. References to revenue recovery from illegal activities, mentions of asset protection for legitimate users of wilderness areas, and discussions of threat neutralization that had nothing to do with arresting criminals. "What would my role be in this initiative?" Clara asked. Webb leaned forward. "Medical oversight for field operations, making sure our teams have proper health and safety protocols, providing emergency response capabilities, and helping to evaluate the medical consequences of various enforcement actions." The euphemism was chilling in its implications. They wanted a doctor who could help them determine how much violence they could use against targets, while maintaining plausible deniability about the outcomes. "I'm interested," Clara said, knowing that refusing would raise suspicions about her motives. "When would operations begin?" "They've already begun," Richard replied. "We're just bringing you into an existing program that's been running successfully for several years." Clara spent the rest of the meeting learning about Operation Clearcut from the inside, hearing the clinical terminology that the conspirators used to describe systematic murder. Target lists were called priority intervention schedules. Assassinations were definitive threat neutralization. The network of corrupt officials was described as stakeholder coordination protocols. As she walked back to her office afterward, Clara felt the full weight of what she'd uncovered. This wasn't just corruption, it was a shadow government operating within the federal bureaucracy, using legitimate agencies as cover for criminal activities that reached into every aspect of wilderness management. That evening, in the secure communication protocols that Standing Bear had established, Clara transmitted her first intelligence report from inside the conspiracy. The response came back within hours, confirming what she'd suspected. Operation Clearcut was accelerating, with new targets being added to elimination lists faster than the Hidden Valley community could warn potential victims. 2 weeks later, Clara found herself on her first field operation, riding in a federal helicopter toward the same Wyoming wilderness where her journey had begun. Webb had selected her to provide medical oversight for what he described as a complex interdiction operation involving multiple agencies and sensitive enforcement protocols. "Dr. Kim!" shouted the pilot over the rotor noise. "We'll be setting down in approximately 10 minutes. The operation commander will brief you on arrival." Clara looked down at the landscape passing beneath them and recognized the terrain near Sector 7, where Cole had sent her into the ambush that started everything. The irony of returning to the same area as part of the conspiracy that had tried to kill her wasn't lost on her. The helicopter set down in a clearing that had been transformed into a temporary command post, complete with communication equipment, staging areas for personnel, and supplies and medical facilities that were far more sophisticated than anything required for routine law enforcement operations. "Dr. Kim," a voice called out as she disembarked. Clara turned and felt ice form in her stomach as she recognized the man approaching, the same electronically distorted voice she'd heard during the attack on the Ranger station, now speaking normally as he introduced himself as Commander Harrison. "Welcome to the operation?" Harrison continued, apparently not recognizing the woman whose fellow Rangers he'd tried to murder 6 months earlier. "We've got a situation developing that requires immediate medical consultation." Clara followed Harrison to the command post, where screens displayed real-time surveillance feeds from throughout the forest. What she saw made her blood run cold: teams of armed operatives moving through the wilderness, not in pursuit of criminals, but systematically hunting down individuals who appeared on federal watch lists. "Environmental terrorists," Harrison explained, pointing to various targets on the screens. "Individuals who've been using remote wilderness areas to coordinate attacks on federal facilities and economic infrastructure." Clara recognized several of the faces on the target list: environmental activists she'd met at conferences, researchers who'd published papers critical of current wilderness management policies, even journalists who'd written articles about corruption in federal agencies. None of them were terrorists. All of them were people whose work threatened the conspiracy's operations. "What's the medical situation?" Clara asked, struggling to maintain her professional composure while watching what amounted to a federally coordinated assassination program. "Multiple enforcement actions scheduled over the next 48 hours, Harrison replied. "We need medical evaluation of tactics to ensure that outcomes appear consistent with the hazards of wilderness activity." Clara spent the next 2 days documenting the most sophisticated murder operation she'd ever imagined. Teams of operators used wilderness accidents as cover for eliminations: climbing accidents, animal attacks, exposure incidents, and equipment failures that would leave no evidence of foul play. Her role was to advise on how to make the deaths appear natural while ensuring operational efficiency. On the second night, as Clara sat in her assigned tent reviewing medical protocols for staged wilderness deaths, she heard a sound that made her heart stop. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the camp's perimeter came the call of a wild stallion. Not Thunder's voice, but something similar. Something that carried intelligence and purpose. Clara stepped outside her tent and saw them at the edge of the firelight, a small herd of Mustangs watching the federal operation with obvious interest. The horses stood motionless, their attention focused on the activities within the camp as if they were conducting surveillance of their own. "Magnificent animals," Harrison said, appearing beside Clara without warning. "We've been seeing more of them lately, almost like they're tracking our operations." "Just wild horses," Clara replied carefully, "probably drawn by the lights and activity." "Maybe," Harrison agreed, but his tone suggested he suspected something more. Though some of the teams have reported unusual horse behavior during operations: coordinated movements, interference with equipment, even direct confrontations that have compromised mission effectiveness. Clara felt a surge of hope. Thunder and his herd weren't just watching, they were actively interfering with the assassination program, protecting targets through the same kind of intervention that had saved her life. "Have there been any operation failures?" she asked, trying to sound professionally curious rather than desperately hopeful. Harrison's expression darkened. 3 missions compromised in the past month. Targets who should have died in wilderness accidents instead survived and escaped. In each case, witnesses reported seeing wild horses in the area immediately before the operation went wrong. That night, Clara transmitted an emergency report to Standing Bear detailing the scope of Operation Clearcut and requesting immediate action to warn potential targets. The response was swift and devastating. The corruption network had identified several members of the Hidden Valley community, and elimination teams were already en route to Echo Valley. Clara's blood turned to ice as she read the intelligence. Jake Morrison, Sarah Chen, and Tom Bradley had all been added to target lists after their visit to the hidden community. Federal teams were tracking their movements, waiting for opportunities to eliminate them in ways that would appear accidental. More terrifying still, the network had somehow identified Echo Valley's location. Satellite surveillance had detected the unusual horse activity in the area, and analysts had concluded that the hidden community represented a significant security threat. A major operation was being planned to eliminate everyone in the valley and destroy all evidence of their activities. Clara found herself facing the moment that Standing Bear had warned her about, the choice between maintaining her cover and protecting the people who'd trusted her with their lives. If she acted to warn the valley, she'd expose herself as an infiltrator and lose the position that had taken months to establish. If she remained silent, everyone she'd come to care about would die. The decision came to her with startling clarity. She wasn't just Dr. Sarah Kim anymore, infiltrating a conspiracy for abstract justice. She was Clara Dawson, the ranger who'd sworn to protect the wilderness and the people who loved it. More than that, she was someone who'd been chosen by Thunder to serve a form of justice older than institutions, older than corruption. That night, Clara disabled the camp's communication equipment and slipped away into the wilderness. She had perhaps 6 hours before her absence would be discovered, 6 hours to reach Echo Valley and warn Standing Bear before the elimination teams arrived. The journey through the dark forest was like traveling backward through time, leaving behind the sophisticated world of federal conspiracies and high-tech assassination programs to enter the primal realm where horses and humans formed partnerships that transcended understanding. As Clara navigated by starlight through terrain that should have been impossible to traverse in darkness, she felt Thunder's presence guiding her, showing her paths that existed only in the ancient memory of the wilderness. She reached Echo Valley as dawn broke over the eastern peaks and found the hidden community already preparing for evacuation. Standing Bear met her at the valley entrance, his expression grim but unsurprised. "Thunder brought word 2 hours ago," he said simply. "We've been expecting this since the day you entered the Interior Department." How did he know? The same way he always knows. The horses have been watching the federal teams, tracking their movements, listening to their communications. When they started planning the assault on our valley, Thunder knew it was time to move to the final phase. Clara stared at him. Final phase. Standing Bear gestured toward the valley where the entire community was engaged in systematic destruction of equipment and evidence. "We've been preparing for this day since the community was founded. We always knew that eventually the corruption would grow too large to hide, and we'd have to choose between exposure and elimination." "What are you saying?" "We're going public, Clara. All of it. Every piece of evidence we've gathered, every crime we've documented, every murder they've committed. We're releasing everything simultaneously to media outlets in 17 countries, to law enforcement agencies that aren't compromised, to international courts that have jurisdiction over crimes against humanity." Clara felt the magnitude of what he was describing. "They'll kill you. They'll kill everyone involved." "Maybe," Standing Bear agreed, "but Thunder has a plan for that too." As if summoned by his name, the great stallion appeared at the valley entrance, his black coat gleaming in the morning light. But he wasn't alone. Behind him came a sight that took Clara's breath away: hundreds of Mustangs, more horses than she'd ever seen in one place, flowing into the valley like a living river of muscle and mane. "Every wild horse herd in the western states," Standing Bear said with awe in his voice. "Thunder called them and they came. All of them." Clara understood then what Thunder had been planning all along. Not just the rescue of individual targets, not just interference with specific operations, but a coordinated response that would make it impossible for the conspiracy to continue operating in the wilderness areas they depended on for cover. The horses weren't just protecting the hidden community, they were preparing to wage war against a criminal network that had turned the American wilderness into a killing ground. As Clara watched hundreds of Mustangs take positions throughout the valley, each one seeming to understand their role in whatever was coming, She realized that her journey from ranger to infiltrator to guardian was far from over. The conspiracy had tried to destroy her, had tried to corrupt the institutions she'd sworn to serve, had tried to turn the wilderness itself into an instrument of murder, but they'd made one critical error. They'd assumed that justice belonged only to humans, that law enforcement was limited to badges and bureaucracy, that the wild places of America would remain passive while crimes were committed within their boundaries. Thunder called out across the valley, his voice carrying to every horse, every human, every living thing that had chosen to stand against corruption. The sound echoed from the canyon walls like a declaration of war, like a promise that some forms of justice were older than governments, more powerful than conspiracies, and more enduring than the human institutions that had proven so vulnerable to corruption. Clara placed her hand on Thunder's neck and felt the power that connected them, Ranger and Mustang human, and spirit guardian and protector. Whatever came next, whether they lived or died in the confrontation that was coming, they would face it together. The battle for the soul of American wilderness was about to begin, and Clara Dawson had found her place in a war that would determine whether justice could survive in a world where truth itself had become a casualty of power. The first assault came at dawn, 3 days after the Mustang Army had assembled in Echo Valley. Clara watched from a rocky outcrop as federal helicopters approached the valley entrance, their black silhouettes cutting through the morning mist like predatory birds. But as the aircraft descended toward what should have been an easy target, Thunder's strategy became devastatingly clear. The horses weren't waiting passively in the valley. They had spread throughout the surrounding mountains during the night, positioning themselves along every approach route, every landing zone, every escape path the federal forces might use. As the helicopters began their descent, hundreds of Mustangs erupted from concealed positions among the rocks and trees. "My God," Clara whispered, watching as coordinated groups of horses charged the landing zones, their hooves striking the ground in patterns that created dust clouds thick enough to blind pilots and ground teams alike. The lead helicopter attempted to land in what appeared to be a clear meadow, only to have a dozen Mustangs materialize from the surrounding brush. The horses didn't attack the aircraft directly. Instead, they created chaos that made safe landing impossible, forcing the pilot to abort and circle for another approach that would never come. Standing Bear appeared beside Clara on the outcrop, his weathered face grim with satisfaction. Thunder spent months planning this. Every horse knows their role, every position has been scouted and prepared. The federal teams trained for a lot of scenarios, but they never prepared for a war against the wilderness itself. Below them, the scene unfolded like something from a fever dream. Federal operatives attempting to establish positions found themselves surrounded by wild horses that seemed to appear from thin air. Equipment was trampled, communications were disrupted and carefully planned. Assault strategies dissolved into confusion as teams found themselves fighting an enemy that operated by rules no military manual had ever anticipated. "How long can this last?" Clara asked, watching as another helicopter was forced to retreat by a coordinated charge from a Mustang herd that had waited hidden in a box canyon. "Long enough," Standing Bear replied. "While Thunder keeps them busy here, the evidence is being released worldwide. Every news organization, every law enforcement agency, every government that has treaties with the United States is receiving documented proof of 30 years of systematic corruption and murder." Clara felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. If the plan worked, if the evidence reached enough people and gained enough traction, the conspiracy might finally be exposed. But if it failed, everyone involved would be hunted down and eliminated with the full resources of a shadow government that had perfected the art of making inconvenient people disappear. Her radio crackled to life, the same secure frequency she'd used to communicate with the Interior Department. Harrison's voice came through, distorted by static but unmistakably furious. "Dr. Kim, we know you're monitoring this frequency. We know you're in that valley, and we know you've been feeding information to domestic terrorists. Surrender now, and we might be able to work out an arrangement." Clara keyed the radio, abandoning the pretense that had defined her life for the past 8 months. "Commander Harrison, this is Ranger Clara Dawson. I died once already because of your operation, but it didn't take. Neither will whatever you're planning here." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Harrison now knew that the woman he'd failed to kill had not only survived, but had spent months gathering intelligence from inside the conspiracy itself. "Ranger Dawson." Harrison's voice was deadly calm when he finally responded. You have no idea what you've unleashed. This isn't just about corruption anymore. You've compromised national security operations, endangered ongoing investigations, and betrayed your oath as a federal officer. My oath was to protect and serve, Clara replied, not to provide medical cover for assassination programs. Around her, the battle continued with surreal intensity. Federal forces trained for urban warfare and conventional military operations found themselves completely outmatched by opponents that moved like the wind and struck with the force of avalanches. Every attempt to establish a secure perimeter was broken by Mustang charges that seemed to come from impossible directions. But Clara knew this tactical victory was temporary. The federal forces would adapt, would bring in heavier equipment, would escalate their response until the horses' natural advantages were overwhelmed by superior firepower. Standing Bear, she said urgently, we need to get everyone out of the valley. This is buying time, but it's not a permanent solution. Thunder has that covered too. Standing Bear replied, pointing toward the valley's far end, where Clara could see people leading pack horses loaded with supplies toward what appeared to be a solid rock wall. As she watched, the rock wall revealed itself to be an optical illusion, a hidden canyon that opened into passages she'd never noticed during her months in the valley. The entire community was evacuating through a network of natural tunnels that would take them deep into the mountain's heart. Where does it lead? Everywhere, Standing Bear said with a slight smile. The mountains are honeycombed with passages that connect to other valleys, other communities, other groups of people who've been waiting for this day. We're not just evacuating, we're dispersing into a network that spans the entire western United States. Clara began to understand the true scope of what Thunder and Standing Bear had been building. Not just a hidden community, but an underground railroad for federal officers and civilians who'd discovered corruption too dangerous to report through official channels. The Mustang herds weren't just protecting Echo Valley, they were guarding a diaspora of truth-tellers spread across thousands of square miles of wilderness. Her radio crackled again, this time with a different voice, Agent Vance, the FBI representative who tried to arrest her at Mary Thunderhorse's cabin. Clara, this is Patricia Vance. I need you to listen carefully. The situation has changed dramatically in the past 6 hours. Clara exchanged glances with Standing Bear before responding. Agent Vance, forgive me if I'm not inclined to trust federal representatives at the moment. The evidence release worked, Vance said urgently. International media picked up the story 3 hours ago. The Justice Department is in chaos. The Interior Secretary resigned an hour ago, and Congress is calling for emergency hearings. But that also means the conspiracy knows they're exposed and they're implementing scorched earth protocols. Clara felt ice form in her stomach. What does that mean? They're not just trying to eliminate witnesses anymore. They're trying to destroy all evidence of their operations, including the wilderness areas where crimes were committed. Clara, they're planning to burn it all down, literally. Through her binoculars, Clara could see new aircraft approaching, not helicopters this time, but fixed-wing planes flying in formation toward the surrounding forest. The implications hit her like a physical blow. They're going to start a forest fire, she breathed. Multiple fires, Vance confirmed. Across every national forest and park where their operations were based. They'll claim it's environmental terrorism, use it to justify even more extreme security measures while destroying evidence of 30 years of criminal activity. Clara watched in horror as the first plane began dropping incendiary devices along the ridgeline surrounding Echo Valley. Within minutes, smoke was rising from dozens of locations, and the wind was already spreading the flames through the dry autumn vegetation. How much time do we have? She asked. Maybe 2 hours before the fires converge on your position, Vance replied. Clara, you need to get everyone out of there now. But even as the evacuation accelerated and the last of the hidden community disappeared into the mountain passages, Clara knew that some battles couldn't be won by running. The conspiracy was prepared to destroy millions of acres of wilderness and countless lives to protect their secrets. Someone had to stay and fight. Thunder appeared at her side as if summoned by her thoughts, his dark eyes reflecting the orange glow of the approaching fires. The great stallion stood calmly in the face of destruction, waiting for her decision with the patience of something that had faced crisis before and emerged victorious. Clara looked out at the wilderness that had shaped her life, at the forests and mountains that had taught her the difference between law and justice, between institutions and principles. The conspiracy could burn the trees, could destroy the evidence, could even kill everyone who threatened their operations. But they couldn't destroy the spirit that Thunder represented, the wild justice that existed independent of human laws and bureaucratic procedures. "Agent Vance," Clara said into her radio, "tell the media that the story isn't over. Tell them that federal officers and concerned citizens are making a stand against the corruption, and that the truth will survive whatever they do to try to bury it." "Clara, don't do anything heroic. The best thing you can do now is survive to testify about what you've discovered." But Clara was already moving toward Thunder, already preparing for the choice that would define not just her life, but the future of federal law enforcement in the American wilderness. Some battles could only be won by people willing to stand against impossible odds, by partnerships that transcended species and circumstances, by guardians who understood that protecting the wild places meant protecting the wildness within themselves. As she swung onto Thunder's back and felt his power surge beneath her, Clara knew that whatever came next would either vindicate everything they'd fought for or destroy them in the attempt. But either way, they would face it together, Ranger and Mustang, human and spirit guardian, and protected in a final confrontation that would determine whether justice could survive in a world where truth itself had become the ultimate casualty of power. The first wave of federal assault helicopters appeared over the eastern ridge at 0800 hours, their rotors cutting through the morning air like mechanical thunder. Clara counted 6 aircraft in the initial formation, followed by ground vehicles that had somehow navigated the impossible terrain to reach Echo Valley's hidden entrance. The conspiracy had committed massive resources to this operation, far more than would be justified for eliminating a handful of rogue federal officers. "They're not just here to kill us," Standing Bear observed, watching the helicopters circle the valley like mechanical vultures. "They're here to erase us completely. No survivors, no witnesses, no evidence that this place ever existed." Clara stood beside a Thunder at the valley center, surrounded by hundreds of Mustangs that had positioned themselves with military precision throughout the hidden sanctuary. The horses showed no fear of the approaching aircraft, their ears forward and alert, their powerful bodies coiled with anticipation rather than panic. "Thunder," Clara whispered, placing her hand on the stallion's neck. "I hope you know what you're doing." The great horse turned his head to look at her, and in those dark eyes Clara saw something that transcended animal intelligence. There was strategy there, calculation, and beneath it all, an absolute certainty that justice would prevail regardless of the cost. The lead helicopter began its descent toward the valley floor, its speakers crackling with electronically amplified commands. "Attention occupants of the valley. You are surrounded by federal law enforcement. Surrender immediately and you will not be harmed." Clara almost laughed at the absurdity of the lie. These weren't law enforcement officers. They were assassination teams using federal equipment and authority to commit mass murder. The promise of safety was as hollow as the legal justification for their presence. "Dr. Sarah Kim," the voice continued, and Clara realized with a chill that they were addressing her specifically. "We know you're down there. Your colleagues are concerned about your welfare. Step forward and identify yourself." Standing Bear touched Clara's shoulder. "They still think you're one of them. You could surrender, maintain your cover, and live to fight another day." Clara looked around the valley at the faces of people who'd risked everything to oppose corruption, at the magnificent horses that had chosen to stand with them against impossible odds. The idea of abandoning them now, of trading their lives for her own safety, was unthinkable. "No," she said firmly. "Whatever happens here, we face it together." Thunder snorted his approval, then raised his head and called out across the valley. The sound was unlike anything Clara had ever heard. Not just the scream of a wild stallion, but something that seemed to carry the voices of every horse that had ever served justice, every Mustang that had ever run free across the American wilderness. The effect on the federal operation was immediate and catastrophic. Every horse in the valley answered Thunder's call, creating a chorus of wild voices that echoed off the canyon walls and filled the air with such volume that the helicopter pilots couldn't maintain their hover patterns. The aircraft scattered like startled birds, their formation broken by what sounded like the awakening of some primordial force. But Thunder wasn't finished. As the helicopters struggled to regroup, he led a charge toward the valley's eastern wall, where the assault teams were preparing to rappel down the cliff faces. Clara had seen the stallion fight before, had witnessed his impossible strength and intelligence. But watching him coordinate hundreds of horses in a tactical response was something beyond her comprehension. The Mustangs flowed up the canyon walls like a living tide, their hooves finding purchase on rock faces that should have been impossible to climb. They reached the federal positions just as the assault teams were beginning their descent, and the result was chaos that defied every tactical manual ever written. Ropes were severed by powerful teeth, equipment was scattered by charging hooves, tactical positions that had been carefully planned and rehearsed were overrun by creatures that fought with the fury of beings protecting their last sanctuary. Within minutes, the eastern assault had been completely disrupted. Clara watched in amazement as similar scenes played out around the valley's perimeter. Wherever federal teams tried to establish positions, Mustangs appeared to drive them back. The horses seemed to understand military tactics better than animals should, coordinating their attacks with precision that suggested supernatural intelligence. "How is this possible?" Clara asked Standing Bear, who was documenting the battle with professional calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "Thunder's herd isn't just descended from cavalry horses," Standing Bear replied, his camera capturing images that would either vindicate their story or be dismissed as elaborate fiction. "These animals carry the memories of every conflict fought in the American West. They know warfare because their ancestors lived it." The federal forces regrouped for a second assault this time, concentrating their firepower rather than attempting to surround the valley. Clara heard the distinctive whine of helicopter-mounted weapon systems spinning up, and she realized that the conspiracy had abandoned any pretense of discretion. They were preparing to destroy the valley with everyone in it. Thunder seemed to sense the escalation. He called out again, but this time his voice carried a different tone, not a battle cry, but something that sounded almost like mourning. Around the valley, the Mustangs responded by taking positions that shielded the human members of the community, their bodies becoming living barriers between the federal weapons and the people they'd sworn to protect. "They're going to sacrifice themselves," Clara whispered, understanding flooding through her. "Thunder's asking them to die for us." But even as she spoke, she heard something that changed everything, the sound of more helicopters approaching, but from a different direction. Clara looked up to see aircraft bearing the insignia of international news organizations, followed by helicopters carrying representatives from the United Nations Human Rights Commission. Standing Bear smiled grimly as he watched the media aircraft take positions around the valley. "The evidence release worked. The international community is responding faster than we'd hoped." Clara realized what had happened. While she'd been infiltrating the conspiracy from within, Standing Bear and his network had been preparing their own operation. The assault on Echo Valley wasn't just an attempt to eliminate witnesses. It was taking place under the scrutiny of international observers who were now documenting every action taken by the federal forces. The commander of the assault operation seemed to understand the changed situation. Clara could hear frantic radio communications as federal officers realized they were committing war crimes under the cameras of international media. The order came to withdraw, but Thunder had other plans. As the federal helicopters began to retreat, the stallion led his herd in pursuit. What followed was the most extraordinary aerial chase Clara had ever witnessed, hundreds of Mustangs galloping across ridges and peaks, keeping pace with military aircraft through terrain that should have provided easy escape routes. But the horses weren't just chasing, they were herding. Clara watched in amazement as the Mustangs used their knowledge of the local geography to drive the federal aircraft toward a narrow canyon where escape routes were limited. The pilots trained for combat operations, but not for dealing with coordinated animal attacks at high altitude, found themselves trapped in a geological formation that left them only one option for escape. That option led directly over a ridge where more international observers waited with cameras and documentation equipment. Every federal officer involved in the assault was photographed and identified their faces broadcast around the world as participants in an operation that would become a symbol of government corruption and overreach. As the last federal aircraft disappeared over the horizon, Clara found herself standing in a valley that had been transformed from hidden sanctuary to international symbol. The Mustangs remained in position, their alert postures suggesting they understood that the immediate battle was won, but the larger war was far from over. Thunder approached Clara as she stood among the community members who'd survived the assault. The great stallion lowered his head, allowing her to see that the marshal's badge was no longer around his neck. Instead, it hung from a leather cord in Clara's hand. When had he placed it there? "He's given it to you." Standing, Bear said, understanding the significance of the gesture. The badge of Marshal James Thunderhorse passed down through 5 generations of guardians. Clara looked at the tarnished silver star and felt the weight of history, of responsibility, of a tradition that connected her to every law enforcement officer who'd ever chosen justice over convenience. But more than that, she felt the connection to Thunder himself, to the magnificent stallion who'd chosen her as his partner in a form of justice that transcended human institutions. The media helicopters were landing now, their crews eager to document the story that would expose the largest government corruption scandal in American history. Clara knew that the coming days would bring investigations, trials, and revelations that would shake the foundations of federal law enforcement. But for now, in this hidden valley, surrounded by Mustangs that had chosen to fight for justice rather than submit to corruption, Clara Dawson finally understood her true calling. She wasn't just a federal ranger or an undercover operative, or even a guardian of the wilderness. She was Thunder's partner, carrying on a tradition of justice that had begun with a Native American marshal and his horse over a century ago. Together, they would ensure that the American wilderness remained a place where truth could not be buried, where corruption could not hide, and where the spirit of wild justice would endure for generations yet to come.